Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is the relationship between two quite vague and contested notions. The first is sustainable intensification or sustainable agricultural intensification, and the second is agro-ecological or socio-ecological resilience. And I'm going to do that mainly by talking about the definitions of these two terms, and then by presenting a case study from New South Wales and Australia of two different sheep grazing systems. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about this notion of scale and system boundaries and how that affects the way we think about the resilience of socio-ecological agricultural systems. So the basic question that I think, or the key question that I'm interested in here, is how do farmers seek to build intensive, biodiverse, resilient farm systems in the face of both ecological and socio-economic perturbations? So some basic definitions. There are many definitions of sustainability, from the classic meeting the needs of the current generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. I personally like definitions around notions of justice, distributional and procedural justice, but I think in general at the core of sustainability thinking, particularly in terms of agricultural systems, is this notion of trying to balance human well-being and environmental integrity, and partly doing that based on maintaining resources, natural capital over time. Within that broader understanding of sustainability, we have this increasingly used notion of sustainable intensification or sustainable agricultural intensification. It's actually a concept that I have quite a lot of problems with, but nevertheless it exists and is becoming increasingly dominant in literature. So basically the premise of this notion of sustainable intensification is the idea that we have a rapidly growing global population and a fixed amount of land, and therefore if you want to be able to maintain both food security and biodiversity, we have to figure out a way of intensifying production while minimizing our impact on the environment. Yeah, it's problematic, but it exists. So what has resilience got to do with this notion of intensification? Why should we care about resilience if we're really looking at this system which tries to optimize yield in order to minimize the spread of agriculture and therefore maintain biodiversity? Well, I think it's potentially problematic if we focus only on optimization, because intensive specialized agriculture potentially lacks resilience and is potentially pretty volatile. So just a few examples here. So we can see, for example, if I use the right button, this is from the Great Dust Bowl in the 1930s in America, where unsustainable land use practices combined with climate conditions led to huge migrations of people away from their livelihoods and their farms. The next example shows the population loss in Ireland during the Great Potato Famine. So this is a really nice example of lack of resilience in socio-agricultural systems. The population was increasing massively in Ireland in the 1840s, and they tried to solve the problem of food supply by basically specialising on one type of potato called the lumper potato. They were very successful in this. They had massive yields compared to what they would have done with mixed agriculture, until potato blight came through the country in 1841 and then a few more times in the next 5 years. This led to, I think, something like 500,000 deaths, and in some counties 30% of the population died or emigrated. We have more modern examples. So these are farmers in India protesting about suicide rates in Indian farming systems, largely due to the Green Revolution and people's desire to modernise their agricultural systems, but not being able to cope with changes in prices either for the goods they sell or the inputs they need in order to maintain their livelihoods. The last example I think is quite a nice piece of research. So this looks at, it's probably quite difficult to see here, but this is average food price indexed over time, and these are civil unrest events mainly in sub-Saharan Africa, Northern Africa and the Middle East, and you can see quite clearly as food prices spike, so does civil unrest. So it's not just the fact that these agricultural systems might not be very resilient, but it's something about the fact that a loss of resilience in that system echoes through the broader systems and can really destabilise whole socio-ecological systems. In terms of stability, so this is from my own research a few years ago, where I was looking at land use practices or land use patterns in the UK and how they affected the kind of the mean expected income you'd get from a particular landscape and the variance. So this first figure here, you can see here is the mean expected income and here is the expected variance, and there's just a clear linear relationship. So there's the higher your expected income is, the higher your expected variance in income is. So this kind of risk and return which you have to balance, and that's quite strongly mediated by land use diversity. So here we have Shannon diversity of land uses, and here we have the expected deviance of expected returns, and you can see that the more diverse your landscape is, the lower your variability in that landscape. Okay, so we've seen this a few times today. My guess is we'll probably see it a few times again. So there are lots of different ways of thinking about the notion of resilience. So the previous example, my research was actually looking at engineering resilience. So I was interested in how quickly a system returns back to its initial point after you give it some kind of perturbation. But what I'm going to talk about now is much more this kind of notion of socio-ecological resilience and maintaining in a particular regime. So Walker described it in terms of the capacity of a system to absorb disturbances, reorganize while retaining essential functions, structures and identity. And I really like this idea of identity. So what is it you're actually trying to maintain? And I think there's a number of questions that we need to ask when we're thinking about resilience. So resilience of what, for whom, and to what. And in the case that I'm going to talk about here, I'm really talking about the resilience of farm systems. So how farms maintain their stability and their income, manage to produce food in the face of different shocks, but also equally in the systems I'm talking about, how biodiversity is maintained within these systems. So these are the two kind of aspects of the identity of the systems that we want to maintain. For whom? So you can think about food system resilience in terms of societal good, but here I'm really thinking from a farmer's perspective. How do individual farmers maintain their kind of identity in the face of perturbations? And to what? So largely in the case I'm going to talk about, it's to changes in precipitation, so floods and droughts. So how do you operationalise resilience? Well, it's pretty tricky. And why do you care about these things? Well, I think one of the things to think about in terms of agricultural resilience is that agricultural systems suffer from these two major sources of perturbations or kind of instability. So on the one hand, they have environmental instability because of changes in precipitation, floods, droughts, but also pest outbreaks, disease outbreaks. But they also suffer from perturbations based on market price, so changes in the price of the inputs they require to produce their goods and changes in the market prices of things that they produce. And there's also some instability based on changing policy. So one of the things which people said led to the food price crisis in 2008 was the policy for biofuels in the EU, for example. So this short-term variability is crucial in relation to both food security and farmers' livelihoods. So often what we see, I think, in agricultural systems, certainly in the West, is we don't see these dramatic regime shifts. But what we sometimes see is that individual farmers simply can't cope with 3 or 4 years of kind of low incomes, and that farm is sold, and then you have bigger farms and you have more specialisation, and you lead to these different kind of system identities. So you go from small individual farmers to large corporations running farms and things. Long-term variability is also important in terms of changing resource use and availability and what this might mean for agriculture intensification. So here we can talk about soil degradation, water scarcity, climate change. Okay, so in terms of the kind of framework I'm going to use here is this notion of general resilience. So this is something that Brian Walker and David Salk talked about when in their book Resilience Thinking, and they basically said there are 3 kind of system properties which are important for maintaining general resilience to non-specified threats. And so the first of these is diversity. So this is something that Albert has already talked about earlier. So the range of different components, and these might be structures, functions, organisms, institutions that you have in your system, which give you some redundancy and ability to adapt based on changing situations. And the second kind of system property is the tightness of the feedbacks. So that's how quickly and strongly the system is able to identify and adapt to and respond to perturbations or changes in some part of the system. And the third is this notion of modularity. So this again is something that I think two of the speakers have talked about before. So on the left here you can see a system which is not very modular, so everything is connected to everything else. And the second one, you can have the same amount of kind of diversity in the system, the same number of nodes, but there's some kind of separation between them. And this again, it is this notion of a double-edged sword. So on the one hand, if you have a shock somewhere in this system, it can spread easily through the system. On the other hand, if you have a less connected system, you have less means of also adapting because there's less connections. So one of the ways that agricultural systems traditionally deal with perturbations is to draw more energy into those systems in order to maintain stable outcomes. And that's less difficult or less easy to do when you have a less connected system. Okay, so the case study I want to talk about is two grazing systems in the Upper Lachlan River in New South Wales. So this is a landscape which is basically only really suitable for ruminant grazing and probably only sheep grazing. There's some areas of crop, but most of it is kind of relatively poor quality soils and quite fragile. And within this system, there are essentially two approaches to farming. So one is conventional management, which essentially you keep your sheep in paddocks spread across your whole of your land. You have high external input, so you use fertilizers and improved vegetation, and sometimes in really extreme things you bolster the net primary productivity by bringing feed in from outside the system. And the second system is something called holistic management, and this tries to somehow mimic the kind of natural grazing patterns of ruminants. So you have large herds in one part of your landscape, you allow them to graze quite heavily and you move them quickly to another piece of the landscape. And you're paying a lot of attention to what's happening to the natural capital within that system. The holistic management relies much more heavily on native vegetation, so they don't use improved forbs or anything like that, but they try and have diverse vegetation which they know exists in that landscape and copes with variability. And you can see these two kind of landscapes. So on the left here is, between this border fence, is a holistic management, and here on the right is improved pasture. You can see things like more scattered trees and more types of vegetation on the left, but probably more productive grassland on the right. In terms of how they try to maintain biodiversity in these systems, it's also quite interesting. So on the left you can see the dark green patches are where you've got large expanses of woodland, which is where most of the biodiversity exists in these landscapes. And so what the conventional farmers do, and this isn't me like saying that conventional farming is bad and don't care about biodiversity and holistic farming is good and do care about biodiversity. Both of the people in these landscapes are actually really quite invested in maintaining biodiversity. But for the conventional farmers, it's something separate from production. So they take the biodiversity out of production, they put a fence around it and say, okay, we will protect this. And in the holistic management approach, they're much more interested in kind of using biodiversity as a means of maintaining the natural capital and therefore the productivity. So they have scattered trees, they have a kind of a more diverse landscape. So why do they need to maintain resilience in these systems? Because they're highly variable. The left-hand figure here shows anomalies in rainfall. So I think in this study area, the average rainfall is between 600 and 800 millimetres a year, and you can see the variance is about 600 millilitres. Millimetres. So the blue lines show flooding events essentially, and the big red lines show droughts. And on the right-hand side, ignore the purple line, but the gold line here shows the price of wool, and the sort of silverish greenish line shows the variability in price of mutton or lamb. And you can see how this variability affects the kind of stocking rates in these systems. So the bottom graph here shows how much lamb and mutton is produced in these systems over the last 40 years. And you can see it's just massively variable. So they have to try and find ways of coping with this variation. So how do they do it in terms of diversity? So for the conventional farmers, diversity is not really the way that they try and cope with perturbations in the system. What they try and do is optimize their system based on drawing inputs into that system. So they have biodiversity as something separate from their notion of resilience. And in holistic management, it's really quite different. So they use the biological diversity in order to maintain natural capital and maintain productivity. So if you have different sorts of vegetation, some of them do better in wet, some of them do better when it's dry. They also use experimentation. So they try different things. They observe their landscape more. They try and think, okay, if this area is doing well, then we can graze it more heavily now, but we'll move on to the next one. In terms of feedback, so again, for the holistic farmers, what they're trying to do is basically adapt to changing situations in the landscape, whereas for the conventional farmers, often what they're trying to do is suppress those changes somehow by kind of maintaining optimum conditions for grass growth by putting fertilizers on, irrigation if they can do it, bringing feed in. In terms of this redundancy and connectivity, modularity into the system, neither of these systems are particularly good in doing that. I mean, it's just the nature of the systems. There's not much you can grow other than sheep. What you do see is that the holistic farmers try and maintain their modularity by having these kind of cell grazing regimes where you can move sheep about across the landscape. So what do these two systems tell us about how the different farmers might maintain maintain resilience in these systems? Well, for the conventional management, essentially what they're trying to do is create this kind of externalized resilience. So they in good years, they build up a lot of capital and they can use that to buy in other forms of energy and materials in order to maintain their production levels when you have a drought. Whereas for the holistic management, the approach is really about internalizing resilience. So it's this dynamic adaptation. It's about understanding the system you're in, destocking when you need to if the carrying capacity reduces, experimenting in your farm, but with little of these kind of external buffers which you can use to stabilize production. So I think where this becomes quite important, where it becomes important in terms of thinking about the relationship between resilience and sustainable intensification, is if we only look at the farm level, it's quite possible to say, well, actually the conventional system tends to be more stable. Like they don't destock as often as the holistic farming system, but partly they're doing that because they're drawing this energy, these economic flows, these energy flows from outside the system. And it's very difficult to assess to what extent that bigger system becomes less stable due to that kind of energy flows in there. So I think the key point I would make here is that we have to be very careful about how we draw the boundaries around systems, both in time and space, when we're thinking about assessments of resilience. And if you focus purely on optimization at a snapshot in time or within a single landscape or system, then often you might lose a bigger picture of what we're doing to the larger system on which that farm actually depends. So just in conclusion, then I would say, if we're thinking about sustainable intensification and diversity, there's basically two ways we can think about biodiversity. We can think about biodiversity as something you keep separate from production, which is largely what the agricultural intensification literature tries to do. Or you can think of it as a means of enhancing production. So you can actually think about biodiversity as a means of stabilizing the system as opposed to a trade-off between biodiversity and production. Tightness of feedback. So the potential problem I see with conventional practices of intensification is that exactly you have these kind of teleconnected feedbacks which you don't sense in the system. So you're not observing changes in the system. In fact, to some extent, you're expanding the the kind of scale of the system. So when you do have a shock you can't cope with, it occurs at a system scale which is much bigger than you can really cope with. We saw this in the kind of banking crisis, for example, where we no longer allow these small collapses and reorganizations, but we draw energy into these systems from places we don't really understand in order to stabilize them. I think this notion of modularity is much more difficult. Highly connected systems are potentially really beneficial for farmers. The fact that you have governance regimes at multiple levels who can stabilize your system by providing you with income and things, the fact that you can draw energy into your system to maintain productivity, these are all beneficial. But potentially they're problematic in the long term because we don't really understand the systems at which we're trying to manage anymore. In fact, we're managing things at the farm scale for systems which effectively are being used at the global scale. So that seems to be exactly 20 minutes, so I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.